My life started like so many others. I grew up in a comfortable house in the quiet suburbs of a medium-sized American city, surrounded by neighbors who greeted us every day and a family that seemed, in everyone's eyes, to be perfect. My name is Ana Luisa, and since I was a child I have always been seen as a happy girl, always laughing and surrounded by friends. My parents worked hard to make sure I didn't lack for anything, and I knew I was loved. At first glance, there was nothing to indicate the chaos that lurked beneath that seemingly perfect surface. 10 years old, something changed. It was subtle at first, like a distant cloud you see on the horizon but don't pay much attention to. I was still just a girl, naive and dreamy, when the world around me started to lose its colors. A friend of our family, one of those people who come in and out of the house like family, who adults trust without hesitation, began to approach me in a way I didn't fully understand. But inside me, something knew this was wrong. I didn't understand why, but his every touch made my stomach turn, as if my body knew I was in danger before my mind could even understand. For a while, I tried to bury what happened. It was as if my mind had closed a door, locked the memories inside and thrown away the key. I continued my life. I pretended that nothing had changed. I continued to smile at my parents. I continued to be the happy girl that everyone expected me to be. But secretly, something inside me was beginning to crumble. The nights grew longer, the dreams more disturbing. I would wake up at dawn with my heart racing, trying to push away images that didn't make sense, but that caused me panic. However, life went on. I grew up, entered adolescence, began to face the normal challenges of school, friendships and first loves. No one noticed that, behind my smile, I was increasingly distant from myself. My mother, always very attentive, started asking if I was okay. "You look tired, Anna. Is everything okay?" I always responded with a smile. I didn't want to worry anyone, and to be honest, I couldn't understand what was wrong myself. When I reached 20, it was as if the silence I had maintained for so long began to suffocate me. The nightmares intensified. I felt constantly tired, as if a heavy cloud had settled over my head and followed me everywhere. My friends, worried, started to move away, not knowing how to deal with someone who was no longer the happy Ana Luisa they knew. My college grades plummeted, and even the things I used to love, like going for a walk in the fresh air or watching a good movie with Clara, my best friend, completely lost their appeal. It was at this point that my mother really intervened. "You need to see a doctor, Anna," she said, her voice thick with concern. "That's not normal." And, in fact, it wasn't. I started seeing doctors, first general practitioners, who insisted that my problem was physical. Maybe it was anemia, maybe chronic fatigue. I took blood tests, took vitamins, but nothing seemed to solve the feeling of emptiness that was growing inside me. My mother, despite all her concern, never suspected the true cause of my suffering. And I, out of fear and shame, never told. After months of no answers, I was referred to a psychiatrist. It was a rainy afternoon when I entered the office for the first time. I sat in a comfortable brown leather chair while the psychiatrist watched me with attentive eyes. "What brought you here, Anna?" he asked in a soft but firm voice. I was silent for a while, staring at the floor. How could I explain what I didn't even understand? I didn't know how to say I was tired. Not about tasks, not about people, but about living. After a few minutes I started talking. At first, hesitant, almost emotionless. I talked about the constant tiredness, the lack of desire to do anything, and finally, I mentioned what had been buried in the back of my mind for so long. The abuse. The room fell silent. He didn't interrupt me, just waited patiently as the words came out of me, one by one, as if each one carried the weight of years of repressed pain. When I finished, he nodded slightly and made some notes in his notebook. After a few minutes of silence, he diagnosed me, severe depression. I left the office with a prescription for antidepressants in my hand and a strange feeling in my chest. Part of me was relieved to finally have an explanation for what was happening. But another part was terrified. Depression. It was a word I had never used to describe myself. It seemed like something distant, something that happened to other people but not to me. The first few days of taking the medication were difficult. I felt disconnected from everything, like I was seeing the world underwater. Consultations with the psychiatrist continued, but each session made me more anxious. Revisiting the trauma of the past was like peeling the scab off a wound that never healed. I was exhausted both physically and emotionally, but somehow I knew I had to keep going. One such night, as I lay in bed, drowning in dark thoughts, I realized that I couldn't go on like this. I had to talk, tell someone other than my psychiatrist. That secret, which I had kept for so long, was destroying me. It was then that I made a decision that would change everything. Clara was the first person I told besides the doctors. She was my best friend since high school, and she was always by my side, even on the hardest days. We knew everything about each other, but I had never told her about the abuse. I arranged to meet her at a cafe, our usual place. When I arrived, my heart was racing and my hands were sweating. She noticed my nervousness immediately. "What's going on, Anna?" Clara asked, her eyes full of concern. I took a deep breath and started to speak. Clara was sitting in front of me, looking at me with that attentive and compassionate look she always had. The cafe was busy, people were talking and laughing around us, but to me the world seemed distant, as if I were in a bubble where everything was stuffy. The sound of the cups hitting the saucers, the lively conversations, everything seemed like a distant echo as my heart hammered in my chest. My breathing was shallow. I knew that after today, things would no longer be the same. "Clara." I started, feeling my voice crack. My mouth was dry, and the words felt stuck, like I was trying to push a boulder up a mountain. She leaned forward slightly, as if she wanted to get closer without invading my space, but making it clear that she was there to listen to whatever it was. I held the coffee cup between my hands, trying to focus on the warmth of it, the smooth edges. It was a trick my therapist taught me, focusing on something physical to ground myself in reality when anxiety took over. It works in part, but at that moment, it felt like nothing could stop me from falling into the abyss that lay before me. "There's something I never told you." The words came out as a whisper, and I felt the weight of them in the air between us. Clara didn't say anything. She just looked at me with those big, sincere eyes, waiting patiently. The silence that followed was unbearable for me. I knew I had to keep going, that I couldn't back down now. My heart was racing, my mind was racing, trying to find ways to start. How do you start a conversation that can change everything? I closed my eyes for a second, trying to remember how my therapist had encouraged me to face the trauma, how he had said that naming the pain was the first step to overcoming it. Then I took a breath and, for the first time in years, I let the words spill out of me. When I was 10 years old, something happened. The phrase hung in the air like a confession, an invisible scar that I had never shown to anyone. Clara tilted her head. Her expression changed slightly, as if she was trying to understand the gravity of what I was about to say. I felt my throat tighten, and tears began to form in my eyes. For so long I kept this secret buried, protecting it like it was a part of me that I could never let go. Now, putting it into words made it all painfully real. I choked, struggling to finish the sentence. I was abused by a friend of my family. The words finally escaped, as if they were exploding from within me. Clara was silent, but her expression immediately softened. I could see the shock in their eyes, but also the understanding. She didn't say anything, just looked at me, as if she knew that any word at that moment could make me fall apart. And so she just waited, letting me process the weight of what she had just said. I felt my chest tighten, and for a second I thought I couldn't continue. My hands shook as I placed the coffee cup back on the table. The tears were now flowing freely down my face, and I knew I couldn't hold it back any longer. Clara, still without speaking, reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. The gesture was so simple, but at that moment, it felt like a lifesaver. That gentle touch gave me the courage to continue. He touched me in a way that I knew was wrong, but I was just a child. My voice broken, as I tried to explain the inexplicable. I didn't know what to do. I froze. I didn't tell anyone because I was afraid, ashamed. And I buried it for so long that sometimes it didn't even seem like it had happened. But it happened, Clara. The words came in a rush now, releasing years of accumulated pain and silence. She squeezed my hand lightly, still without interrupting me. I knew she was giving me space to continue to get it out of me, but her eyes were already full of tears. Seeing this made me feel less alone. For the first time, someone other than me was feeling that pain. I was no longer alone with my secret. Everything changed after that. I continued with a trembling voice. It was as if a part of me had died. I started having nightmares, moving away from people, but no one noticed. I gave a sad smile. I was good at pretending, you know? Pretending I was fine, that nothing had happened. I smiled, Clara, even when all I wanted was to disappear. I looked at her face, waiting for some reaction, waiting for her to say something, anything. Maybe I wanted her to tell me that everything was fine, that I didn't need to continue, that what I had already told her was enough. But she just stood there, her hand still on mine, her eyes shining with understanding. And now all this is back. My voice was almost a whisper, the weight of revelation taking over me again. I never got over what happened, Clara. I just buried it so deep that when it came to the surface, I fell apart. Depression. I swallowed, trying to find the right words to explain what was happening inside me. It's not just sadness. It's like I'm stuck in a hole with no way out, and every day is more difficult. I can't pretend I'm okay anymore. Clara finally spoke. His voice was soft but firm, full of restrained emotion. Anna, I can't imagine the pain you carry, but I'm here. She shook my hand once again, and at that moment, I knew she was serious. I'm here and I'll be by your side. You don't have to go through this alone. Those words, simple as they were, broke through my defenses. I felt a wave of relief mixed with sadness. It was strange to feel relief after sharing something so painful, but it was as if, for the first time, the burden wasn't just mine. I was no longer alone with my secret. Clara knew. And she didn't run away. She stayed. We cried together in that cafe. It didn't matter what other people were thinking when they saw two friends crying in public. In that moment, all that mattered was that, for the first time in years, I wasn't fighting my pain alone. There was someone on my side. When we left the cafe, I felt exhausted, like a monumental weight had been lifted from me, but exhausted nonetheless. Sharing this was like reliving the pain, but it also brought a strange sense of freedom. Clara, next to me, insisted on walking home with me, and I let her. I needed his presence more than I wanted to admit. When we arrived at the door of my house, she turned to me, her eyes still full of emotion. You're not alone, Anna. You never were. I just didn't know before. But now I know. And I will be here always. Those words, you're not alone, kept echoing in my mind as I walked up the stairs to my room. For the first time I felt like maybe there was a way out. It wouldn't be easy, and I knew I would still have to face many dark days. But now there was a light, a small flame of hope, that Clara had lit in me. And at that moment, even in the darkness, that was enough to keep me standing. After that conversation with Clara, something in me changed. The silence I carried like a second skin had been broken, and although the pain was still there, something else had emerged along with it. The possibility of healing. Not a quick or easy cure, but a path, a small beam of light at the end of a tunnel that, for so long, seemed endless to me. The next morning, I woke up with the same tired feeling that was already part of my routine, but something inside me was different. There was a lightness, a realization that, now, I didn't need to carry that burden alone. After that conversation with Clara, a small but significant change began to emerge within me. Even though the pain hadn't gone away, nor the ghosts of my childhood dissipated, I knew I was no longer alone. Sharing what had happened, even with one person, made that weight, which for so long seemed unbearable, become a little lighter. It was still there, of course, but now there was someone who knew, someone who could understand, and somehow that brought a new perspective. I had taken a first step. The next morning, the world still looked the same, but inside I was different. The emptiness was still there. The tiredness that had become part of me was still with me, but a small flame of hope was beginning to shine in the back of my mind. Feeling that someone was by my side, that I didn't have to face this alone, was powerful. However, true change is slower than we would like. I still woke up not wanting to get out of bed. Every movement seemed to require more energy than I had to give. Simple everyday tasks such as showering, eating, or even answering messages on your cell phone still seemed Herculean. My body was moving, but my mind was exhausted, as if I had been through a war that I could never win. As the days went by, I knew I would need to talk to more people. Clara was by my side, but my mother and father still lived in complete ignorance of what I was carrying. They saw the signs, of course. I knew that my mother, with her heightened sensitivity, felt something was wrong, but I never knew exactly what. She would always ask, with that look of someone who desperately wants to help, but I would always divert the subject, murmuring that I was tired or that I had a lot of college work. But the truth is that the wall I had built between us was too high to be torn down with a simple conversation. The next few days were like a blur. Appointments with a psychiatrist continued, and the medications, although they alleviated some of the anguish, left me in a state of numbness, as if I were seeing the world through a fog. Therapy helped me process the trauma, but it also brought to the surface pain that I preferred to keep buried. Each session was an emotional battle. Revisiting what happened to me at age 10 was not only painful, it was like reliving the trauma. The pain came back with a vengeance, as if it had never really gone away. And in many ways, she hadn't. It was always there, waiting to emerge again. However, something inside me began to change. I could no longer keep hiding the truth from my mother. One afternoon, after another therapy session, I returned home with my mind buzzing with emotions. My mother was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, as the soft late afternoon light streamed through the window. She looked at me with that worried look like she always did and asked if I was okay. It was a routine question, but that day, the words that came to mind were ready to come out. "Mom, can we talk?" The question came out before I could stop myself. She dropped the knife immediately, her face now filled with genuine concern. We sat at the kitchen table, where so many conversations about trivial things had taken place over the years. But this time it was different. I could feel the weight of what I was about to say building in the air between us. For a moment, I was silent, staring at my hands, not knowing where to start. My mother, however, didn't pressure me. She stood there, waiting patiently, knowing that whatever it was, I needed time to find the right words. Finally, after a few minutes that felt like an eternity, I took a deep breath and began. "Mom, there's something I never told you." The voice came out hesitant, broken, and I saw her face harden slightly, as if she already knew that what I would say next would be devastating. I told her everything. From the beginning. Since I was 10. I told him about the man who should have been a friend, about the unwanted touches, about the shame and fear that consumed me. I told how I buried it for so many years, and how, little by little, it destroyed me from the inside out. I told him about the emptiness, the depression, the sleepless nights and the nightmares that haunted me. And for the first time, my mother knew everything. I couldn't look directly at her while she spoke. I didn't want to see the pain I was about to cause, but I knew I needed it. When I finished, the silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. My eyes were full of tears, but still, I couldn't look up to look at her. I knew that this was all a shock to her. For a mother who has always tried to protect her children, hearing that something so horrible had happened right under her own nose was devastating, to say the least. Finally, after what seemed like hours of silence, my mother sighed. A long sound full of pain, frustration, and sadness. When I looked at her, I saw tears streaming down her face. But what surprised me most was the calm in his voice when he finally spoke. "Anna, I'm so sorry," she began, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry for not seeing it, for not realizing it. My God, how could I not have noticed?" The words came out as a lament, as if she were blaming herself. I knew this would happen. I knew that by telling my mother she would try to find a way to carry the guilt too. Her pain was as obvious as mine in that moment, and part of me regretted telling her. But another part knew it was necessary. We couldn't continue living as if nothing had happened. "It's not your fault, Mom," I said, my voice low but firm. "You didn't know. I did everything I could to hide it. I was scared." She looked at me, her eyes red from crying, and got up, coming towards me. When she hugged me, I felt the weight of years of silence come crashing down on us. I cried like a child, sobbing in her arms, and she held me tightly, as if she wanted to protect me from all the pain that had already hit me. "We will get through this together, daughter," she murmured against my hair. "I'm here, and I will never let you face this alone again." Those words, "I will never let you face this alone again," echoed inside me like a promise. I knew the road ahead would still be long and painful, but for the first time, I felt like I was no longer alone. Not completely. My mother knew now, and even if it meant facing a new set of challenges, we would face them together. The days following this revelation were confusing and emotionally exhausting. My mother tried to be strong, but I would see her crying alone in the kitchen, or hiding in the bedroom when she thought I wasn't paying attention. I knew she carried the blame, even though I repeated 1,000 times that it wasn't hers. She knew that seeing her daughter suffer like that was a pain she never imagined she would feel. But she remained firm by my side, as did Clara, and little by little, I began to feel that there was a small support network forming around me. In therapy, the sessions were still painful, but now, each revelation seemed to strengthen me a little more. I was facing my past one piece at a time, and although I knew complete healing might never come, the idea of learning to live with my scars started to make sense. I would no longer be defined by what happened to me. I would be defined by how I chose to move forward. The silent pain I had carried for so many years had finally come out of the shadows. My mother and father now knew, and as devastating as it was to tell them, something inside me began to change. I hoped that after revealing my secret, immediate peace would emerge. But the truth is that healing is not something that comes with a single revelation. The pain was still there, latent, and the scars I carry have not disappeared. They became more exposed, but the weight they caused was relieved by knowing that, finally, I was no longer alone. My parents reacted in different but complementary ways. My mother, always protective, dedicated herself even more to being by my side. She looked at me with a mixture of pain and guilt, as if in some way, she was trying to make up for the years I suffered in silence. It was almost suffocating care at times, but I understood that she needed to deal with the guilt in her own way. My father, on the other hand, sank into silence. It was his way of processing things. Since the day I told him, he became more introspective, and the moments we talked were full of unspoken words, of a silent pain that he seemed to carry in his eyes. Despite this, there was a new strength within me. I felt like, somehow, this opening process was allowing me to rebuild parts of myself that I didn't even know had been destroyed. I still had my moments of despair, those days when it seemed impossible to get out of bed, when the emptiness inside me became so great that all I could do was cry. But now, when those days came, I knew there were people by my side. My mother, my father, and Clara gave me the strength that, for so long, I thought I would have to find on my own. One day, during one of my therapy appointments, my therapist asked me something that had never crossed my mind. "Anna, have you thought about the future?" she asked calmly, as she always did. First, the question seemed strange to me. For so long, my life was about trying to survive the past, dealing with the shadows that haunted me. The future seemed like a distant idea, something that didn't belong to me. The best I could imagine was surviving the next day, the next week. But what came after that? I don't know if I'm ready to think about the future, I admitted, looking at the floor, the words seeming heavy. "It's okay," she replied. "It doesn't have to be a detailed plan. Just start allowing yourself to imagine. Think about who you want to be beyond the pain, beyond what happened. What would you like to do if you could?" I had never thought of it that way. I hadn't considered that there might be something other than pain. The therapist smiled, as if she understood the turmoil in my mind. She knew that asking me to imagine a future was a huge step, but she also knew that this step was necessary. I left that session with the question echoing in my head: who do I want to be beyond the pain? That night, alone in my room, I allowed myself to think about it. For the first time in a long time, I tried to imagine a future where depression and trauma weren't the only things defining my life. Maybe it would be possible, somehow, to build something new. But what would it be? Deep down, a spark of curiosity ignited. What would come next? What could I do with everything I survived? I knew that this idea of starting over would be slow and full of uncertainty, but I began to feel a desire, albeit fragile, to try. In the days that followed, the concept of future slowly began to take shape. It was not a sudden decision, nor an epiphany. It was a gradual process, a small idea that started to grow in me, fueled by the conversations I had with Clara and the reflections in my therapy sessions. My therapist's question still echoed in my mind. What would you like to do if you could? Clara, as always, was a fundamental player in this process. She never forced me to think about the future in an abrupt way, but she knew exactly how to guide the conversations so that I began to consider the possibilities. One afternoon, as we were walking through the park, she brought up something I had left behind. "Do you remember how passionate you were about law?" she asked casually while kicking a fallen leaf on the path. I paused for a moment, processing what she had said. Before everything happened, before depression swallowed me completely, I was studying law. I had dreams of becoming a lawyer, of helping people fight for justice. This desire, however, had been stifled by the weight of the trauma. I almost forgot who I was before everything fell apart. I forgot about that, I admitted, my voice low. Clara smiled softly. "You don't need to decide anything now, but maybe thinking about it will help you. Law was your passion, Anna. And even though you left, who said you can't come back?" The idea of going back to college, of resuming the course, seemed scary to me. It had been so long since I had abandoned my studies, so consumed by pain and depression, that the idea of returning to my academic routine seemed impossible to me. But at the same time, something inside me lit up. Maybe it was possible after all. I didn't know if I wanted to follow exactly the same path as before, but the possibility of studying again, of dedicating myself to something that brought me purpose, started to make sense. In one of the following sessions with my therapist, I told her about the conversation with Clara. "I thought about going back to studying," she said, still uncertain. "I don't know if I'm ready, but it's something I've been considering." She smiled, her gaze full of understanding. "That's a big step, Anna. The important thing is that you're allowing yourself to think about these possibilities. Even if you're not sure, it's already progress." I left that session with a feeling of hope, albeit mixed with fear. The idea of going back to school scared me, but it also excited me. Returning to college didn't just mean following a course. For me, it was a symbol that I was ready to fight for something beyond survival. It was a chance to redefine myself, to see myself as something other than the victim of trauma. Over the next few weeks, I started researching courses. Although law was still something that appealed to me, I realized that my desire to help people had changed shape. Before, I wanted to fight for justice in court. Now I felt that my true passion was helping other people deal with their own pain, just as Clara, my mother, and my therapist had helped me. I decided I wanted to study psychology. I knew, more than ever, how fragile the human mind could be, and I also knew how essential it was to have someone by your side to help you rebuild when everything seemed lost. I didn't tell anyone about my decision right away. I wanted to make sure this was what I really wanted before sharing it with my family. I continued going to therapy, strengthening my mind and emotions, knowing that the road to full recovery was still long, but feeling for the first time that there was light at the end of the tunnel. When I finally told my mother about my decision to return to college to study psychology, the pride I saw in her eyes moved me deeply. She always believed in me, even when I didn't, and seeing her so excited about my decision made me feel like I was on the right path. I knew the journey ahead of me would be difficult, but now there was something to fight for. I was no longer just trying to survive the past. I was building a future still uncertain but full of possibilities. Taking back control of my life, in some ways, seemed like an almost impossible task. In the months following the decision to return to college, fear and anxiety were constant presences. I tried day after day to convince myself that I was doing the right thing, but there was always that voice in the back of my mind that told me I couldn't do it. "You're not ready. You're not over it yet. What if you fail again?" These doubts echoed constantly, making the simple act of filling out the university application form seem like a gigantic step, a mountain that I wasn't sure I could climb. But something inside me, a little spark that had been growing since I started sharing my trauma, drove me. I no longer wanted to be a hostage to my past. It was time to move forward. I started filling out forms for the psychology course, each click on the computer filling me with nervousness, but also with determination. The mere idea of going back to school left me with trembling hands, but I knew that this was the path I needed to take. I told Clara and my mother about my decision before I even told my father. They, always present and supporting me, did not hide their excitement. Clara hugged me tightly, smiling with her eyes shining with pride. My mother, on the other hand, smiled softly, but her eyes showed an emotion far greater than words could express. "I knew you'd find your way," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I always believed you were strong, Anna." I still didn't feel as strong as they thought I was, but I began to realize that perhaps true strength wasn't in the absence of fear, but in the decision to move forward, even with him by my side. It was a slow and painful process, but now I was beginning to believe that healing was possible. I no longer expected to completely overcome the trauma, but I was beginning to learn to live with it, to give space to the scars, without letting them determine everything I would be. When I told my dad about my decision to return to college, he was silent for a long time. I could see the pride in his eyes, but also the worry. He, more than anyone, knew how much I had suffered. I knew how fragile I had felt these past few years, but he also knew I was willing to try. "Are you sure you're ready?" he asked, his voice low but full of affection. "I don't want you to put too much pressure on yourself." "I'm scared, Dad," I replied, being honest. "But I think I'm ready to try, and if I fail, I'll try again." He nodded, pulling me into a tight hug, as if he wanted to convey his trust to me, as if he wanted me to know that no matter what happened, he would be by my side. "You won't fail," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I know you can do it." With registration complete and the support of my family around me, I prepared myself for what came next. I knew that the path back to college would be full of challenges, but this time I was no longer alone. I was no longer fighting the pain in silence. The first few days at psychology school were a mix of nervousness, excitement, and fear. I felt a little out of place at first, as if I no longer belonged in this academic environment. While other students seemed so confident and at ease, I found myself trapped in my own thoughts, always trying to convince myself that I deserved to be there, that I had the right to start over. The classes were intense, and the content was challenging, but I found myself fascinated by everything I was learning. Psychology, once just a distant area of interest, now seemed to make sense on a deep, personal level. I understood the importance of what I was studying because, in a way, it was about me. I was learning about the mechanisms of the human mind, about trauma and its consequences, and, at the same time, learning to name the processes that had dominated my life for so long. The neuroscience classes about how the brain processes emotional pain, and the cognitive behavioral therapy classes, which covered ways to deal with self-destructive thought patterns, were more than just theory to me. They were pieces of knowledge that helped me understand myself. Even with this connection to studies, there were times when I wondered if I would be able to continue. The pressure was real, and the emotional weight of dealing with content so close to my own experience often left me exhausted. But on difficult days, I remembered the words of Clara, my mother, and my father. He remembered everything he had already faced, and that was what kept me moving forward one day at a time. It was during one of these classes that I made a new friend, Daniel. He was a classmate, always discreet and focused on his studies, but during one of the breaks between classes we started talking. At first, it was just about the course content, the subjects, and the difficulties we were both facing. But over time, the conversation deepened. Daniel was someone who, like me, carried his own scars. He didn't say what he had been through, but I could tell between the lines of his words that he also knew the weight of emotional pain. "Psychology saved me from myself," he said once while we were having coffee during one of our breaks. "I chose this course because I want to help people find the light that, for a long time, I couldn't see." Those words resonated with me in a way I didn't expect. It was as if, for the first time, I had met someone who truly understood what it meant to lose yourself in your own suffering. Daniel didn't need to tell his story for me to know that he, like me, was seeking healing. Our friendship was formed from this mutual understanding, and little by little, He became more of a support in this new phase of my life. As the weeks went by, the academic routine began to settle in, and I, little by little, began to find my place in college. The fear still existed, of course. There were days when the weight of the past still pulled me down, and I felt tempted to give up. But whenever these thoughts would arise, I would remember who I was becoming. No longer a victim of what happened, but a person capable of transforming their pain into something that could, in some way, help others. As the months went by, I started to feel more and more comfortable in college, but this transition was not easy. Every day, I faced the same inner monster that had dominated my life for years. The fear of not being enough, of failing, of not being able to move forward, was still there, constantly whispering in my ears. However, the difference now was that I had tools. I had people by my side and, most importantly, I was learning to live with the pain instead of trying to escape it. My psychology classes were a constant source of self-discovery. Every time we studied something new about the human mind, I found myself reflecting on how it applied to myself. It was as if, by studying other people's behavior, traumas, and emotional scars, I was also studying my own healing process. One day, during a class about the importance of resilience in coping with trauma, something the teacher said deeply impacted me. People tend to believe that resilience is about being strong all the time. She began, her gaze sweeping around the room full of attentive students. But resilience is actually about the ability to adapt, to find ways to move forward, even when everything seems to be falling apart. These words resonated with me like an echo. For so long I had believed that being strong meant never showing weakness, never allowing others to see how much I was struggling internally. But little by little, I was learning that true strength wasn't in hiding my pain, but in continuing to live despite it. That's what I was doing now, every day. I wasn't healed, maybe I never would be completely, but I was learning to live with my scars, to accept that they were part of me. That same day, I had a conversation with Daniel that also helped me solidify this new perspective. He and I had become close over the weeks, and although we never talked openly about our traumas, there was a mutual understanding between us. We both knew we were carrying heavy baggage, and in a way that brought us even closer. We were sitting on a bench on campus, watching the other students pass by as the sun began to set. Daniel was reading something in his notebook, but I could tell he was distracted, lost in thought. "What are you thinking?" I asked, trying to start a conversation. He looked up, a slightly sad smile on his face. "I'm thinking about how, for so long, I thought I couldn't get here," he said, closing the notebook with a sigh. "But now that I'm here, I realize the battle is not over. The pain is still there, you know. I just learned to deal with it differently." I nodded slowly, understanding exactly what he meant. It's as if we're always waiting for the moment when the pain just goes away. But it never does, I added, looking at the sky that was starting to change color. "We just learn to live with it." Daniel looked at me, his eyes full of understanding. "Yes, exactly that. Live together. And I think that's what makes us stronger. Not the fact that we don't feel pain, but our ability to continue even though we feel it." His words stuck in my mind for days. I knew he was right. Strength was not measured by the absence of pain, but by the ability to move forward, to get up every day and try, even when everything seemed lost. That's what I was doing now, and that's what I intended to keep doing. However, as with any healing journey, there were times of relapse. One of those moments came unexpectedly, on a random night, when I was in the middle of a pile of books, studying for an important exam. The pressure of college, coupled with the emotional fatigue I carried daily, began to weigh on me more than I was prepared to admit. I felt the familiar lump in my throat and the familiar tightness in my chest, reminding me that the depression was still there, lurking. I put down the books and went to my bedroom window, looking at the darkness outside. The feeling of emptiness invaded me, and suddenly, all the doubts returned with full force. Why am I doing this? Am I really capable of helping others when I'm still so broken inside? Maybe I'm not good enough to continue. Anxiety began to consume me, and I felt the need to isolate myself, to hide from the world, as I had done so many times in the past. But then something changed. Instead of giving in completely to despair, I remembered Daniel's words, the conversations with Clara, the nights when my mother held my hand. I was no longer alone. I didn't have to face this alone. I picked up the phone and, without thinking much, I sent a message to Clara. "Can you talk?" She responded almost immediately. "Course. What's going on?" I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should tell him what I was feeling. Part of me was still stuck in the old habit of hiding the pain, of pretending everything was okay. But I knew that, to continue, I needed to let go of this habit. So I took a deep breath and wrote, "I'm having a rough night. I just needed to talk." Clara did not disappoint me. He called at the same moment, and upon hearing his voice on the other end of the line, I felt a wave of relief course through my body. We didn't talk about anything in particular, not even what I was feeling. We just talked about trivialities, laughed about things that only we understood, and little by little, the feeling of despair began to diminish. I knew the pain was still there, but at that moment, it didn't seem so unbearable. "Thank you for always being here," I said, my voice low but sincere. "I always will be, Anna," she replied with the calm certainty that always comforted me. No matter what happens. I hung up the phone with a lighter heart. Knowing that I could count on Clara and the people around me was, without a doubt, one of the biggest changes in my life since I started facing my past. I no longer carried everything alone, and that made all the difference. The weeks that followed were a combination of ups and downs. There were days when I felt confident, where I could see the future with hope and enthusiasm. But there were also days when the past seemed to come back with a vengeance, reminding me of the wounds that were still there. However, the difference now was that I knew those days would pass. I no longer felt trapped in an endless cycle. I was building a new path, a new me, and even though this path was uncertain and full of challenges, I knew I was heading in the right direction. The psychology course became not only a potential career, but also part of my healing process. Each concept, each theory that I learned about the human mind helped me understand a little more about myself, about how my brain had processed the trauma, about how depression worked and how I could find ways to cope. Everything I learned seemed like a piece of a bigger puzzle, and little by little I was putting together the image of who I wanted to be. Friendship with Daniel also became an important pillar at this stage. He understood my struggles in a way few people did, and we often talked about our personal challenges, about how the journey to recovery was full of twists and turns and surprises. But the fact that we had this mutual understanding brought us even closer together. I knew I still had a long way to go. Depression wouldn't disappear overnight, and the scars from my past would still be with me for a long time. But now I had something I never thought I would have: hope. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time that didn't scare me so much. I was learning to live with uncertainty, to embrace challenges, and to forgive myself for not being perfect. The healing process was long and painful, but I was moving forward. And no matter how slow this path was, it was taking me to a better place. In the end, I realized that maybe it's not about reaching a point where the pain no longer exists, but about learning to live with it, in a way that doesn't stop me from being happy, from growing, from reinventing myself. And that, for me, was the biggest step of all. As time went on, I felt more and more comfortable with the college routine. Although the challenges continued, and there were times when the shadow of depression hung over me, something fundamental had changed. I had learned to ask for help. Recognizing that I didn't need to face everything alone was one of the most important steps in my journey. And with that came the understanding that vulnerability, contrary to what I thought, was not a weakness, but a strength. The study of psychology was becoming more intense and, at the same time, more revealing. Every lesson, every classroom discussion, helped me understand not just others but myself. I began to see what had happened to me from a new perspective, more technical, but also more compassionate. I wasn't to blame, and my pain was valid. Abuse and depression were parts of my story, but they didn't need to define my future. The trauma I carried for so many years was a deep wound, but little by little it was beginning to heal. I still had relapses. There were days when I felt suffocated by anxiety, when sadness arrived suddenly and left me feeling powerless. But now, in these moments, instead of closing myself off, I opened up. And that's how one night, during one of these episodes, I found myself sitting on the floor of my room, tears streaming down my face, with the phone in my hands. It was late, but I sent a message to Daniel. I didn't have to say much, just 3 words, "I'm scared." In less than a minute, he responded, "I feel that way too sometimes. I'm here, want to talk." Reading that was the first relief. Talking to him, knowing that he also knew this fear, brought a sense of calm that I hadn't expected. I called him and we talked for hours. Daniel reminded me of something very important that night. It was not necessary to overcome fear, but rather to learn to continue despite it. I didn't need to be perfect. I didn't need to have all the answers. The simple act of acknowledging that I was struggling and still moving forward was enough. The next morning, the dark clouds hanging over me were still there, but somehow they seemed further away. It was as if the conversation with Daniel, combined with everything I had been learning, had lifted some of the fog. I knew there would be difficult days, but I also knew that I had built a support network and, more than that, a new view of myself. The semester was approaching the end, and with that, the pressure of exams and assignments increased. The study routine absorbed me completely, and I felt the weight of each test, each reading. Still, something inside me remained firm. I was slowly finding a balance between my studies and my mental well-being. There were days when I needed to give myself a break, allow my mind to rest, and I learned that this was part of the process too. I didn't need to be flawless. Life didn't demand perfection, just presence and effort. One day during a class on anxiety disorders, something in particular caught my attention. The professor, a strong and confident woman with a long career in clinical psychology, began to talk about the roots of anxiety. His words, however, touched something deeper within me. "Anxiety is often seen as an enemy," she said, her tone firm but at the same time welcoming. "But in fact it is a sign that something inside us needs attention, that there is a part of us that feels insecure, unprotected. And instead of trying to suppress anxiety, we must learn to understand it, because it teaches us where our vulnerable points are, where we need more love, more care." That stuck with me. The anxiety that so often paralyzed me, that so often made me doubt myself, was simply not something to be fought. It was an indication that parts of me were still hurting, needing attention. And just as the teacher suggested, I began to change my approach. Instead of fighting my anxiety, I started trying to understand it, asking myself what was behind that fear, what I really needed at that moment. This mindset shift wasn't easy, but it made a huge difference in my healing journey. On days when I felt more anxious, more vulnerable, I tried to remember the teacher's words. I started to ask myself, what do I need right now? What is this anxiety telling me? And often the answer wasn't immediately clear, but just allowing myself to ask these questions helped me navigate the emotional storm in a more compassionate way. Over the months, my friendship with Daniel grew even stronger. He remained a constant presence, and our connection went beyond our shared trauma. We talked about our dreams, about what we wanted to do after college. For him, the future was a mix of excitement and uncertainty. I wanted to work with young people, help people overcome emotional challenges, but at the same time, I knew the journey wouldn't be easy. "I don't think I'll ever be completely ready to deal with it all," he said once as we walked across campus. "But perhaps the key is to accept that we will never be perfect. There will always be challenges, there will always be bad days. And yet life goes on. We learn to move forward together." I agreed, knowing he was right. The path ahead would never be completely clear. Life by its very nature was uncertain. And perhaps it was precisely this uncertainty that made us stronger, because it forced us to live in the present, to deal with what we have now, and not with what we could have had or what we would like it to be. "And you?" he asked, changing the subject. "How do you feel about the future?" I thought for a moment, letting the question hang in the air before answering. Scared sometimes, but also curious. For the first time in a long time, I'm curious about the future. Daniel smiled, that crooked smile that I had grown to like. "Curiosity is a good start. I think it means you're ready to explore what lies ahead." Little by little, I began to accept that life is made up of ups and downs, moments of pain and overcoming. That relapses did not mean failure, but part of the process. I was learning to forgive myself for bad days, to not punish myself for not being perfect. What once felt like a never-ending struggle with depression and anxiety was now becoming a journey of self-compassion and growth. At the end of the semester, when I sat down to take my last exam, I realized how much I had changed since starting college. I was still Ana Luisa with all my scars and fears, but I was also a version of myself who had learned to get up, even after falling. I was rebuilding myself piece by piece, and this new version of me was stronger than I could have imagined. After the last exam, I walked to the park where Clara and I used to meet. She was there waiting for me with the same welcoming smile as always. "How it was?" she asked while hugging me. "It was good." I smiled, feeling the weight of the last few months beginning to dissipate. "I think I'm finally starting to find my way." She smiled back, her eyes shining with pride. "I always knew you would find it." At that moment, I realized that the future was no longer scary. He was uncertain, yes, but now I was ready to face him. I had learned that true strength was not in avoiding pain, but in carrying on, even with the scars. And I, more than ever, was willing to move forward. With the end of the semester, it's also time to reflect on the path I've taken so far. When I looked back, I was no longer the same Ana Luisa who sank into the void every day, nor that girl who hid her scars from everyone, trying to pretend that everything was fine. No, now I was a version of myself who had learned to stand up, to fight, to find support, and most importantly, to not be afraid to show my vulnerability. I still carried the scars, of course. They were there, in plain sight. But for the first time, I saw them as marks of survival rather than emblems of weakness. As classes ended and summer vacation approached, I began to feel the weight of the past lifting, being replaced by the expectation of an uncertain but promising future. Now, I knew I could handle uncertainty. I no longer needed all the answers right away because I was learning that life is a constant journey of discovery. And I, more than ever, was willing to continue. Daniel and I continue to meet regularly, our conversations often mixing the present and the future, dreams and fears. He had become more than a friend. He was an anchor, someone who, like Clara, had come into my life at just the right moment. Our friendship was deep, built around the battles we both fought internally, but also the shared hope that we could be something beyond those battles. One night, sitting by the lake on campus, Daniel did something that took me by surprise. He looked at me, his face partially illuminated by the soft moonlight, and asked, "Ana, where do you see yourself in 5 years?" The question stopped me not because of its content, but because of the fact that, a few months ago, I wouldn't have been able to answer it. The future was something that scared me, that left me paralyzed. But now, upon hearing his words, I felt a wave of calm wash over me. It was the first time I didn't see the future as a lurking monster, ready to take me down. "I see myself helping other people," I replied after a while, choosing my words carefully. "I want to use everything I've learned, everything I've been through, to make other people feel like they're not alone. I think deep down that's what keeps me going. The idea that I can turn pain into something that matters." Daniel smiled, nodding his head in agreement. "I always knew you'd find a way," he said softly. "You have something that many of us are still trying to discover. Resilience. It's not that you're immune to pain, but you've found a way to carry on despite it." Those words were engraved on me. Resilience. The idea that I had somehow found the strength to move forward despite all the weight of my past moved me deeply. I wasn't the same person who started this journey, and in some ways I knew I would never be again. But now I accepted it as a positive thing. The pain I had carried for so long, that I so often thought would destroy me, had become the foundation upon which I was rebuilding myself. At the end of the summer, something unexpected happened. I received an invitation to participate in a seminar on mental health, organized by one of the professors on my psychology course. The event aimed to bring together students and professionals in the field to share their experiences and learnings, and discuss strategies to support emotional health, especially in the context of trauma. When I read the invitation, my heart skipped a beat. Talk in public about what I had been through, about my struggle with abuse and depression. It was something I never thought was possible for me. I showed the invitation to Clara and Daniel, looking for support. They, of course, were quick to encourage me. "You need to do this, Ana," Clara said, with the enthusiasm she always had for me. "Your story can help so many other people." "I agree," Daniel completed with his calm and firm tone. You have a unique perspective, a story of overcoming that can really make a difference. And, most importantly, you are no longer alone. We will be there with you. The idea of talking openly about my trauma still scared me. But now, I knew that fear didn't have to paralyze me. I had a mission, a responsibility to people who, like me, were struggling in silence. I knew how much a voice, a testimony, could make a difference, and if I could be that voice for someone, then that would be why I would go through this fear. The night of the seminar, nervousness invaded me, but I knew I was doing the right thing. The room was full of students, teachers, and mental health professionals, all there to hear stories, learn, and share experiences. When my name was called, I felt a rush of adrenaline. I walked to the stage, my hands shaking, but my heart firm. I knew this was more than a speech. It was an end to everything I had faced. It was my chance to turn pain into strength, to give a voice to those who still couldn't speak. I remained silent for a moment before starting, observing the audience, feeling the presence of Clara and Daniel between the chairs. When I finally began to speak, the words came out of me like catharsis. For many years I lived in silence. My voice echoed throughout the room, and I felt everyone's attention focused on me. I pretended that everything was fine, that I was strong enough to deal with my pain alone. But in truth, the pain was consuming me, and I was afraid to admit it. Fear of being seen as weak. Fear of not being understood. I took a deep breath, feeling the emotion building in my chest. Today, I am here because I finally understood that true strength is not in hiding pain, but in sharing it. My voice shook slightly, but I continued. I survived abuse and depression. I still have difficult days. I still struggle with my own fears and insecurities. But instead of hiding, I learned that asking for help is an act of courage, not weakness. I looked at the audience, their faces attentive, some visibly moved. And if I can leave one message here, it's that no matter how deep your pain is or how alone you may feel, there is always a way out. And sometimes that way out begins when you decide to give up the silence and let the people around you help carry the weight. When I finished, the silence was replaced by a wave of applause. I felt light, as if a cycle had finally closed. I had turned my pain into words, and those words now had the power to help others. I walked off the stage with a sense of relief and accomplishment that I had never felt before. When I left the room, Clara and Daniel were waiting for me with beaming smiles. "You were incredible," Clara said, hugging me tightly. "That was your victory," Daniel added, his eyes full of pride. At that moment, I knew the journey was not over. She was just getting started. But now I was sure I was ready for whatever came. Because at the end of the day, what really matters is not how deep you've fallen, but how determined you are to get back up. I looked out at the horizon, sitting on the park bench where so many deep conversations have taken place over the past few months. Clara and Daniel were beside me, laughing at something I could barely hear as my mind was filled with thoughts about how much my life had changed. Today, I recognize myself as a woman who learned to rebuild herself from her own rubble. The pain still exists, it always will. But for the first time, I'm not afraid of her anymore. I accept it, I understand it, and most importantly, I choose to live despite it. The message I have now for myself and for those facing their own silent battles is simple. We are stronger than our traumas, braver than our fears, and more resilient than we ever believed ourselves to be. True strength is not in never falling, but in get up every time, with the scars that remind us of where we came from, but with our eyes focused on where we want to go. Life is not about waiting for the storm to pass, but about learning to dance in the rain. And me, I'm dancing.
If this story captured and moved you, don't forget to like the video, share with those who love intense stories like this, and subscribe to our channel. Your participation is essential for us to continue bringing more narratives that will surprise you and stir your emotions. Don't miss the next chapter of this incredible journey.